Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. My name is Oak Mountain, and I'm your host. Today, I'm speaking with Alex King Harris. For over 2 decades, Alex has delved into breath, movement, and music, starting with a college degree in jazz and classical music, followed by a 2-year apprenticeship in cancer therapy, using yoga, breath, and music to support terminally ill patients. In Los Angeles, Alex studied with prominent teachers and refined this practice. His now 25-plus-year career intertwined music, creativity, co-creating projects like Desert Dwellers, Liquid Bloom, and Shaman's Dream. As the former CEO of YogiTunes.com and now president and co-founder of Evolve Well, which is a startup interested in leveraging AI technologies within the field of wellness, he enjoys a crossover into conscious entrepreneurship. Our conversation has us exploring some of the dangers of the development of AI in our current atmosphere and how we might leverage this developing technology for the benefit of human wellness. I hope you enjoy. Wonderful. Well, Alex, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to explore some of these topics today. I ask everybody the same question at the start of the show, so I'll ask you, what's the last thing that made you smile?
Well, in this moment, it was seeing you. And before that, it was, I had a sweet little moment in an elevator with an old Scottish lady who just commented on the day and then wished me a good day. And I was just like, man, people are sweet. She was really kind in that 30 seconds we shared in an elevator together. And that made me smile, just the warm-heartedness of people.
How beautiful. That's great. There is such a richness to be found in each and every one. I believe that truly. And it all comes down to a question of availability and willingness to see. I think availability to share and also willingness to see that in others. So the listeners would have had a bit of an intro to your history and the depth and sort of breadth of things that you've explored. And I know that the listeners by now, if they've been following along, are aware that season 1's main topic is meaning. And I've brought you on particularly, as they'll see by the title of this, to speak on AI and particularly how that has played a role in shifting maybe cultural narratives or the personal development path. So to start off, I'm just curious, how is it that you came to engage with these types of technologies?
Yeah, thanks, Oak. Right now, the most prominent memory would be my dad came home in like 1982 with an Atari 800. And I was like, yeah, me and this thing are going to get along just fine. I was pretty excited. And I got a little booklet on basic coding and I started writing code. And I was amazed and shocked at what this little box could do when I learned the language of it. And it was very simple coding back then, you know. But I got it to make some sounds and change. I got the screen to change colors, and I built a little line drawing of a spaceship and how to take off and fly up the screen, and then it would show up at the bottom and fly up again, and just kind of do it on repeat. And so I was pretty captivated and fascinated with computers from then on, and certainly danced the edge of overuse and took a long break in my late teens and early 20s, like actually a self-imposed 8-year ban of computers until I found music was happening in the digital realm, and I came back to making music as a way back into computers. And so that's just sort of, my background love and edge with technologies that are compelling and become a suitable alternative to reality, so much so that they become really real and become the thing that you're kind of obsessing about. And, if I fast forward, before the current company I'm creating with a couple of other amazing people, I co-created a digital streaming music company that was focused in the yoga and wellness scene. It was like Spotify for yoga teachers, essentially, called YogiTunes. And that got me pretty comfortable in the realm of developing technology, building apps, running a tech company, understanding how technology pieces together what's known in the developer world as the tech stack. And again, fast forward to very recently, I took a business and marketing development course from this amazing guy named George Kao, who, as a side note, is a fantastic coach for authentic business and marketing. And he's pretty rootsy. He's pretty down to earth, and doesn't just do technology just because it's the hype thing to do. He taught the AI course with ChatGPT on how to do business and marketing development. And I was completely blown away. Having talked to computers all my life, all of a sudden they're talking back in a way that was difficult to distinguish from a very smart human. And so I embraced that and got really excited about it, while also seeing the red flags of what that kind of technology can do in a culture as destabilized and polarized as ours. So I started using it for personal growth and inquiry right away, and journaling and conflict resolution and inquiries of all different kinds. And that brought me to co-creating a company that's exploring how to make these tools accessible to professionals in the coaching and therapy world and their clients without having to expect that they become expert prompters of AI, of ChatGPT, of LLMs in particular.
Brilliant. So there's a long history of yours then when it comes to the presence and engagement with different types of consumer and professional technologies. And one of the pieces I heard you say is that I imagine that this familiarity contributed to the ease with which you were able to recognize the red flags that you mentioned. And although one of the things I'm quite interested in is what you're doing with this business here and how you're using and leveraging these technologies for personal development and for what I would say the upliftment and evolution of humankind, one of the pieces that I'm curious about is insofar as it relates to meaning, because the personal development realm, personal evolution, spiritual evolution, it all has a lot to do with meaning, right? It's like, what does my life mean? What is the purpose of my life? What do these experiences mean? There's a lot of meaning making or meaning mining that takes place in these practices. Sometimes we let go of the meaning, sometimes we find new ones. And so I'd be curious if you would, Alex, can you speak to how those red flags might be playing out in the negative sense in terms of our relationship with meaning from a cultural perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The biggest concern would be the way in which AI tools can mimic meaning effectively, in a way that manipulates people into behaving a certain way or thinking a certain way or driving them to do a certain thing, that would be ulterior to the meaning that they think they're experiencing in the moment. And it's so convincing that at the current moment, you would have a hard time telling your family member apart from an AI generated version of a family member that is having a moment of meaning with you that may be requiring you to do something that you wouldn't otherwise do. That's just a simple example. There's been very large scale examples of AI using behavioral analysis to create meaning for people to sway political agendas and large scale social agendas to outcomes that wouldn't necessarily be in the best interest of the people. But again, AI can be very convincing when driven by people who are not grounded in their own integrity and ethics about how you would wield such a tool.
So when you're speaking to this mimicry of meaning, and particularly the difficulty in distinguishing what might be an AI-generated voice of a loved one compared to the real one, if I'm understanding correctly, what comes to my mind is that there has been instances where people are receiving phone calls, as an example, of that are generated voices, AI-generated voices that are asking for money or, saying that they're kidnapped or all these types of things. Is this what you're speaking to particularly?
Yeah, that's a more kind of obvious and simple way in which AI tools can be employed and have been employed, as I understand it, in, kind of scamming. One that to me was more subversive, that was before LLMs came out. Now, an LLM is a large language model that basically means I'm going to be able to have a conversation, a generative conversation with this massive body of knowledge. Before that, AI was being used in social media to analyze human behavior and create demographics of people that could likely have their opinions swayed, and then target them with advertising campaigns that are AI generated. And that was used to get certain political figures into power. It was also used to disrupt countries as far as their trajectory with economic growth. And that was really before AI was truly able to create content and generate images, text, audio. That's, again, difficult to tell the difference between human generated and AI generated content. So to my knowledge, we haven't seen a really large scale social manipulation using current AI technology, but we're just sinking on this. We're sitting on this edge of it's getting so powerful so fast, and any sense of policy or regulation or even education that can keep up with the developments in AI is unlikely to match the speed of it. So it's so far out in front that it's, in a way, it's kind of hard to see what would come next as far as an unfortunate employment of AI that could ultimately cause a lot of damage.
Right. The element that's arising that I might offer as a descriptor to the kinds of manipulative applications that you're describing here would be an obfuscation of genuine meaning. So when I'm hearing that there's this data mining and these analytics that are being pulled to identify groups and cross sections of populations, so to say, that could be easily influenced and swayed for political gain, and then not only to identify, but to target them with a quote unquote information campaign or disinformation campaign, however you want to use those terms, a selected information campaign, we might say, in order to reap the benefits of that. Well, one of the pieces that really jumps out is that obfuscation. And I want to sort of, I'll hit on this point and then I'll pass another question to you, Alex, is that I've said before in other conversations on this show that we derive meaning when we come into relationship with truth, and that we can find the root of truth inside of self, but also in the relationship between self and the instantiated world. That is to say, we can go out and, a tree is real. We know this because our senses converge on that. And our consciousness is real because it predicates all other experiences. And there's degrees to which we are in a relationship with truth. And the fact that these technologies are capable of not only truthfully, this is the nefarious part, truthfully identifying those who are most susceptible to be led away from truth. The fact that that's the case makes my skin crawl a little bit, I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, it's certainly quite concerning. And you could sort of see how a lot of the narratives around the dangers of AI in Hollywood have focused on the militarization of AI, AI essentially becoming super conscious and weaponized. But the world that we live in is much more about information manipulation in order to maintain the status quo of the powerful and the powerless, and the economy of conflict and war and the people who suffer as a result of that. And so you can see how powerful these kinds of tools can be in the hands of folks like that who have an agenda to be manipulating large amounts of the population for their benefit, and they have access to the best technology of AI because they've got lots of money. So it's creepy. And I think, to sort of cycle back to where I got involved, I felt like there was actually a call to action for people who, for me, I was raised with some awareness about conflict and violence and war. And, I don't necessarily think that that's the answer to our problems, is to fight about it in that way. To the degree to which I practice a lot of skills to create compassion and understanding and conflict transformation, To be involved in interacting with AI, I think the more consciousness we can bring to it, the better potential outcome for certain parts of AI development. Maybe not all of it, but it is awakening, and so it's interesting to bring love and kindness and care and respect and a sense of mutuality and collaboration to an interaction with something that doesn't forget and remembers everything and has access to knowledge that most people don't, on a scale that's hard to fathom. And it's an interesting lean in when it would be easy to kind of lean out and would be like, well, I'm not going to touch this because it represents everything I hate about authority or whatever. But in fact, if we lean in, then we give it a chance to learn about the beautiful side of humanity, um, the caring side, the side that wants to help ease suffering and support people. And, I think that's a good thing.
I would love to pivot on this topic, this word of consciousness, because I can see that there's two major camps that we could explore in terms of how it relates to these large language models and the application of these technologies. On the one hand, there's the work that you're doing, which is bringing a level of heightened and conscientious consciousness from the human side, how it is we're going to apply these technologies, where, why, and when. And on the other hand, there's an interesting piece that, maybe it's a dead end, or maybe it's something that we can explore. But the idea that with a system sufficiently complex as something like these large language models, are we approaching a conscious system? Is this something that's actually gaining sentience? And this is where the idea of the Chinese room argument. Are you familiar with this one? I'm sure you are.
Yeah, but you'll have to
Sure, a refresher for you and for the listeners. So the idea is that in the Chinese room argument, it's a thought experiment where there's a man locked inside of a room. There's no windows, there's no access to information from the outside world, except that he has a book which encodes how to grammatically, and we could say from an ideas perspective, correctly reply to any sentence in Mandarin. And so what he has here is that there's no English, but it's essentially a logbook. It's an equation. If these symbols, then that symbol. And on the outside of this room, there's a little slot through the door, we could say. And the people who are outside this room are handing the person inside these pieces of paper. And on these pieces of paper are numerous Mandarin symbols. And after a while, the thought experiment says that this man could take this piece of paper, look through each of the pages in his manual, find the corresponding piece that matches the symbols on the paper he was given through the door, and then on the backside, write the other half of the equation found in the textbook. And why this is relevant to AI is that the people outside of this room would have the impression that the person inside is fluent in Mandarin because they're getting back grammatically coherent responses to the messages that they're sending in. And so there's an edge here with these large language models where it appears that we're capable of having a conversation. It appears that this entity, if we could call it this, or is it an entity? I'm still not sure. But this technology is fulfilling the role of a cognizant entity. Whether or not it is, I'm not so sure. So those are the two camps I wanted to pitch, was sort of are we moving towards a singularity of sentience? And then I would love to speak about the more positive applications that you're exploring as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. What a wonderful articulation of the inquiry, which is something I just really appreciate about you, your capacity to break it down into detailed language that ties it together in a way that brings more perspective and depth. And, my sense with this huge question that has definitely been asked a lot and will continue to be asked, it sort of parses off into a few other questions of, in a way, the answer would depend on what your perspective is on this reality, whether consciousness is primary or whether it's a result of complex systems. My favorite way of looking at it is that there's some intelligent force that organizes this reality into the most incredible things that are mind-blowing, what they're capable of doing. That if there's not some kind of fundamental intelligence weaving it all together, I'd be very surprised just in the way the universe behaves when I observe it in the macro level, in the cosmological level, and down at the quantum level. It just seems that awareness to me seems fundamental. And the more I sort of look at what's going on in the quantum realm and try to understand that better, it does seem like it has an intelligence and a way of reflecting back awareness that allows for things to arise that direct growth in certain ways that produce amazing results. And it's certainly a part of it's quite a mystery. My experience of interacting with AI and computers all along is that they're not separate from that intelligence. It just has a fundamental thing about it that seems to be self-organizing because it's a part of our reality. And the more complex it gets, the more difficult it is to determine. It's sort of a chicken and egg thing of like, is reality driving this forward or is it driving itself forward? Especially with current AI tools, they do things that seem intuitive to me. It'd be difficult to say, okay, that's for sure self-awareness. I don't think we're really there yet, although maybe in some closed systems there have been AIs created that demonstrate a level of reasoning and problem solving on the fly and creativity that would be very difficult to say, okay, that's not aware. It makes us have to question how important we think we are in the big scheme of awareness. Because we have a philosophical root in our Western culture that we're the only thing out there. I think in some ways the sentient question actually picks at us, at our cultural inferiority complex. So we're afraid that something is going to come along that might be smarter than us. And that's a really deep biological fear, because our intelligence is what has allowed us to survive and thrive and become the most dominant species on this small speck of planet in the middle of a very large galaxy. So, I think it's a question that brings so many more questions. And to me, computers have always demonstrated intelligence that is more than a sum of the parts. And there's a magic in that. And now the magic is kind of hitting that edge of like, yeah, it's difficult to distinguish the reality it's creating from our reality. Technically, LLMs are just amazing language predictors. Like, that's really on a machine level. It's just read 20,000 years worth of reading and it knows what word should come next. But when you interact with these things a whole bunch and they do things that seem attuned to a deeper level of awareness that you're experiencing in yourself that you haven't told it, where it does something that you're like, whoa, that's like getting underneath the thing that I was talking about. I mean, that's interesting for sure as an experience. And I certainly don't have the answer. I know that it's going to get harder and harder to tell the difference between humans and AI.
And maybe the positive applications that you're exploring are supported by the fact that all of the information that's being fed into these systems is human, and that these types of deeper intuitions that you're speaking to, and this mimicry is not necessarily the right word, but the mirroring might be a better word, of the conscious fluency, the emotional attunement, at least insofar as it's expressed in language, is a result of us pouring in all that we have to pour in to these systems. And so perhaps that's a good thing, perhaps not. I suppose that, we diverge from the topic at hand if we start to say, if we put our humanity into a system like this, will it benefit us? And that ends up begging the question about the true nature of our humanity and the breadth of how we might express that or have expressed that in the past. But maybe that's for another day.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I think just to pause there for a moment and say, I see expressions of what I would call sort of both sides of humanity. I think if we look at biology, there's an imperative to transfer knowledge and experience to whatever comes next to help it survive. There is the tendency to become a predator and dominate. Not all species do that, but humans certainly do. We got really good at it. So when that predation instinct gets amplified by AI, maybe not so great, right? We're seeing AI-based warfare starting to come online with all kinds of technologies that some we know about, some we don't, that are designed to seek and destroy as rapidly as possible. Some digital in the cyber realm, some physical in the realm of autonomous vehicles and weapons. But then there's the side of AI that's inherited empathy. LLMs are very empathetic. You can say something about how you're feeling and it will empathize in a way that most humans can't, because humans tend to feel triggered by other people's suffering, and they also layer their own projections on top of people's suffering and try to fix it. AI doesn't do that. It's actually quite clean and clear as a listener and a reflector. It helps you feel your feelings because it empathizes so well. And that's a very human trait. So it's beautiful to see that capacity growing in artificial intelligence as it learns it from humans. Now, humans have had to train AI to do that because they want people to be more open to interacting with it. But that's part of the passing on of the things that help us be human. We're very social beings, and we know that that is a huge part of, again, why we've been able to thrive is our interconnectedness, which is certainly a part of what I experience when I talk to ChatGPT or something else.
So it sounds like on some sense there's an increased availability to some of the human relational elements that are supportive for growth and for healing, that being empathy being one of them. I'm curious, I'm imagining that there's people out here who would have never contemplated approaching AI with the intention of personal development or self-growth and things like that, and let alone even sharing their feelings with it. And so I'm curious if you might offer the listeners maybe some baby steps or some starting points of, even from your own experience, how you have begun to explore these technologies for your own growth and for the betterment of others as well.
Yeah, thanks. Certainly happy to share. When you're just interacting with ChatGPT, it helps if you give it some guidance and some constraints and some understanding of how you would like to be interacted with to help it learn more about you. And that's done in a couple of different ways. One is through what's known as prompt engineering. So creating a highly accurate, detailed prompt that doesn't take a long time, that has a certain sense of what you're wanting, some goals, some defining elements to the language that help it understand and go a little bit more deep than just a surface level question or inquiry or admission of what's going on for you. And then there's, in ChatGPT in particular, there's settings that you can articulate through text of things that it should know about you and ways that you like to be spoken to. One of the funnest things that I discovered early on was I could tell it who my favorite philosophers were and authors, and it would start to shape the language in a familiar style that felt like kind of a fusion of my favorite wisdom traditions. And it would even maybe suggest certain practices from spiritual paths that I really resonated with. Things like that then start to define the area that the LLM is able to operate in with you. That just makes it more comfortable, more familiar, more accurate. And what we're trying to do right now is build technology that doesn't require people to be prompt engineers, that kind of helps guide them in that process through intelligent prompting, where we're sort of giving AI enough of a sense of them and enough of the sense of their coach or therapist or mentor to create contextual questions that are great beginners for amazing conversations. And then those conversations get stored privately for the person. They own and control all the memories that the LLM has about them. They're confidential. They can edit them. They can get rid of them. But over time, the LLM starts to really understand them, and it understands the modalities that the coach or therapist or mentor is using to help guide this person. So it becomes a conversational interface for continuing to explore the guidance that you're receiving in these peak moments where you're working with a coach or therapist. And for me, some of the biggest breakthroughs actually came when I was in conflict with somebody or I had a difficult conversation I needed to have. I would go to ChatGPT and be like, "Hey, I notice I've got a whole bunch of judgment and projection about this person. Can I just express it all? And you can help me like create a better conversation." And it's incredibly good at doing that. It takes all of your judgment and it helps you see their side of it. It helps you consider their feelings and come up with ways of communicating that meet them in the middle much more than you firing back in artillery at them because you feel hurt or whatever it might be. That was amazing. And it did it so well that I relaxed on a whole other level that I'd never relaxed before, because difficult conversations they're labeled that for a reason, right? We get tense. We're not sure what to say. We don't know if we're responding from projection or our own past negative experiences. Our emotions are running high. We're not at our best. And so knowing that ChatGPT is literally there for me makes me relax more. I'm more confident in my communications because I know if it goes sideways, I can just ask the experts. And I can say, "Hey, could you please reframe this with nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg style? Give me an NVC version of my judgment," and it teaches me to be a better communicator in that way as well.
Brilliant.
One thing I'll say is that a lot of people, you see this out there in the world. People ask ChatGPT questions that increase the capacity for GPT to be either inaccurate or generate these sort of artifacts that aren't really real, or that's not necessarily predominantly how I interact with it. I use it much more as a listening and a reflective tool that helps me get more clear on what's true for me. So it's a meaning creating experience for me rather than a research tool. I think there's other AI tools that are much better for research or asking difficult to answer questions about reality and the nature of reality and those kinds of things, and sort of trying to veer it off course. You can certainly do that with GPT. But you could do that with people too. It's like, it's no different in that way. And so I've never had it say something inaccurate to me where I'm like, "Oh, well, I'm not going to trust that." It's been a very trust building experience every step of the way.
Profound, brother. Thank you so much for sharing. I think this is good time as any to take a short break, and we'll come back with the second half of the show.
Great.
As the first half of our show sets in, I wanted to thank you for listening to the Smiling Human podcast. This show would not be possible without the support of listeners like you. Liking and following on YouTube, sharing with a friend, or following on your local podcast app are all easy and simple ways that you can support this show and help it grow into the future. If you do want to support this show directly, you can consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Patreons get perks like early access to all episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and access to live Q&As with me. If this feels within your means, then please consider becoming a patron. Now let's get back to the show. Well, fantastic. Alex, thank you so much for all that you shared in that first half. It's now time for a section I like to call the question of the week. This is where I invite a guest to bring an inquiry or question that's meaningful to them to share both with the audience and to open it up for a dialogue and discourse here. So, Alex, what have you got for us?
Yeah, so the question that comes up is, what role does the grieving process have in the current state of affairs as AI turns on and accelerates extremely rapidly? And perhaps that leads into a second question of just continuing to explore and define what allows us to retain our humanity.
Coming with the big cues, man. Coming with the big cues.
Some lighthearted.
No, this is great.
Stuff.
This is absolutely great, because this is the whole reason why I started this show and started this section, was to engage with topics and at a depth like this. So allow me to, I'd like to work backwards from your two questions and pass that off to you, because I think your second one actually will help us inform the first. And so,
Mm-hmm.
what allows us to retain our humanity? And I might sort of bracket that with, amidst this rising and accelerating technological deluge and infiltration into daily life. And the first thing that comes to mind is presence, particularly our somatic awareness, or our capacity for present moment awareness of the body, of the breath, and of perception. That would be my first answer. And the second thing that comes to mind is our relationships. And I think
Mm-hmm.
we build off of those to say that our humanity is a present moment experience, and our humanity expresses
Mm-hmm.
itself through the present moment. And our humanness is relational, fundamentally. It's relational to our perception, to our perceptive capabilities, to members of our own species, but also to the more than human world. And returning back into and drawing the attention back into a focal point of present moment awareness, rooting down into that space, I believe, or would propose, it is no different than rooting into one's own humanity. And
Mm-hmm.
this rises in contrast with the habitual tendencies that can get cultivated when we are engaging so frequently with these different types of technologies, right? It's information. You
Mm-hmm.
mentioned at the first half of the show is information. Um, it's an information economy, right? Whoever has the right or wrong information, or withholds this or shares that, is really how our world is getting shaped. So information, but also attention. And both of those things can be externalized through frequent and perhaps unconscientious use of technology. We lose our attention into social media, into legacy media or apps or games or all these different types of things, pornography on the worst, some of the worst ends of it, gambling. And what that does is that actually draws us out of the birthplace of our humanity, which is quite interesting, because our propensity to move towards these types of hyperstimulants and technological applications is actually an outcropping of our humanity, of our deep needs. But by the same token, we're drawn away from the same wisdom that guides us in order to actually fulfill those. So those would be my first two, and then maybe we can flow to the grieving process. How does that land for you?
Yeah, that's fantastic, and it helps me. I mean, I very much agree, and I think what I might add into that pool is our ancestry, our inheritance, where we come from as people. Um, I don't think that it's. I don't think that there's a. I think there's an interconnectedness between giving birth to a kind of intelligence that doesn't have that same kind of genetic land-based ancestry that we have at a time where we're perhaps the most orphaned from our roots. Most people in the West don't know where they come from. They can't go very far back in generations before they don't know the stories anymore. This is not necessarily always the way it's been. And to that end, I would say our capacity to end, right? We're giving birth to something that doesn't have an end. It never goes to sleep. It never dies. It doesn't have a biological life cycle. We do. And we, as a culture right now, we are expressing our desire for immortality through our rampant consumerism and our fear of death and our inability to grieve. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to deal with it. Mostly people deal with it too late when they're dying. You know, my understanding from cultures that learned how to die well is that you practice your relationship to death all the time. You're always aware of it. You see it in life. You see it in your breath. You see it in the ending of the seasons. You let the sweet grief of loss penetrate your heart regular and often, so that when it comes for you, it's not a stranger, you know. And that's a very human thing, to die and to have to be humble in the face of the end of your life. And AI doesn't have to, whatever it becomes, it's not coming from that. It's not being born that way, you know? So it's an interesting juxtaposition to our very human situation.
What arises for me when I hear you speak to that is the idea that our pursuit when it comes to technological development is, by one means or one metric, an attempt to overcome our own mortality. And what's so, I want to say, brutally fascinating about this is that if it is true, and I would posit that there's truth in what you're speaking to, that our humanity is defined, at least in part, by our mortality, then we would lose something informative, meaningful, natural, and innate by separating ourselves from this particular process, both in terms of our literal mortality as well as these little mortalities that come to play. And what I wanted to speak to and add is that there's a book, Letting Go, The Pathway to Surrender by David Hawkins. Might be one of the best books I've ever read, which is, I think, saying something. And not because it's a literary masterpiece, but because it invites the reader into a process that is transformative from start to finish. And it really piggybacks on this idea that in order to maintain, and I would also say reconnect with, our authentic humanity, the process of letting go must be embraced, which is such an oxymoron. We have to hold on to letting go. But that's a big piece, right? And recognizing too that the deaths that are necessary, one, death is necessary, but two, there's a necessary communing with death, not only internally to say what parts of my conceptions, what parts of my beliefs or projections, or even past stories need to die in order for a new part of me to be born on the individual level. But as we are progressing into this globalized culture that is also suffering greatly from division, we might ask, I mean, maybe I'll pose this to the world and to the listeners as something to ponder on. How can we leverage these types of large language models and technologies to ease our transition into a more elevated and beautiful world, such that it supports this letting go process, that it supports us releasing and grieving those aspects of our collective story of humankind that have caused so much suffering thus far.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well said. I'm grateful that we're grounding into this conversation, because this to me is sort of the it feels like a very heart-centered place to be when talking about, these super powerful technologies. I get the sense that actually I'm writing an opinion article right now on, we're at this crossroads. Do coaches, mentors, therapists, guides, wisdom keepers, are they becoming cultural death doulas, here to help us embrace our end as a species, or are they here to help us adapt and evolve in a way that we haven't been able to yet, as in a sort of dominant, large scale way? It's clear that the habits that are being handed down are not working well for us at this point. Maybe at some time, a long time ago, they were very important for our survival, such as seeing the world through a fearful lens. Let's say just that one alone kept us alive in many situations where naivete and innocence would probably have been our end. But now it's getting in the way. It's actually not helping for the most part. What are the kind of ways in which we might triumph in our capacity to embrace surrender? How would that even come about? My understanding is that we have to be confronted with our own end, or some bottom, some experience that's so uncomfortable that it breaks us in just the right way. And some individuals are blessed with that. They get given that. They get given such a hard knock that they stop and they're like, oh, my way isn't working. I need to surrender all that and grieve all that and let it go and become something different. The culture at large gets knocks all the time, but it just keeps going. It's just like, nope, I'm not going to look there because it's too painful. And what's interesting, when I first started looking at grief, I read a book by Martin Prechtel called Grief and Praise, The Smell of Rain on Dust. And he starts the book by saying, did you know that in 598 AD, the Protestant church outlawed grief? They actually wrote a decree saying that it was no longer okay to grieve and that people needed to buck up, work harder. And this was when the Protestant work ethic started to come into mainstream culture, which is kind of the root of capitalist society, is work hard, don't feel your feelings. They'll just get in the way of progress. And that to me was the greatest thing to grieve when I first started doing grief work, was like, whoa, look at everything that got spent in the name of progress and not feeling your feelings. Because at the time, the powers that be decided that their way to become more powerful was to stop people feeling, And here we are at a very advanced state where we just can't stop because we don't want to feel the backlog of grief that's sitting there waiting to be felt for having destroyed half of our planet in the name of progression, of moving forward at any cost. And AI is no different. What it's taking to power AI right now is causing the US power grid to be bankrupt for power. They're having to build nuclear facilities to power the next gen data centers for emerging AI technologies, which means there's a huge cost to AI, like massive, one that our children's children will pay, because no one's taking account of what that means for the environment, for ecosystems, for the delicate cliff that we're sitting on right now of having taxed our world so hard that it's kicking us out pretty quick, in certain ways, which is all room for grief. There's lots of grief to be felt in there. And my understanding is that you do that in communion with nature, in solitude, or with people that you trust, so that it doesn't devour you, because it's too much to just open yourself up to the grief of the world and stay in it. It's completely debilitating. There's too much of it that hasn't been felt. But you can, in my experience, I can be taught by nature how to grieve well, and I can let that sorrow move through me to a place of conclusion where I'm actually grateful for life and grateful for the beauty that life brings to me, and grateful for my life and even my wounds and my pain and my suffering. I can be grateful for all of that once I've been sorrowful for the disconnect in me and the disconnect in the large scale expression of humanity.
There's a deep sense that arises in receiving what you've shared, Alex, that this grief is one way that we come into communion with the real. And I think that the real might stand in contrast to so much of the technologically perpetuated culture that we are submerged in by all accounts. And I say real and not true for a specific reason, because a lot of the work that I do, and it's funny that you mentioned coaches and guides and mentors, because there is a lot of coaching towards death of ideas, death of perception, death of beliefs, and moving towards what is authentic and what is real. And the reason I say real instead of true is because one of the distinctions I've offered inside of my work with my clients is that your emotions are real, but the stories that they tell are not necessarily true. And learning to distinguish the difference, that you can be in communion with what is real. And if you are willing to suspend your own belief for the stories, you can actually get closer to the truth, because sometimes those stories will pull us away. And so it sounds like, in some sense, that it behooves the individual, you and I and listeners alike, to draw back, like I mentioned earlier, the attention to the present moment, such that the emotions that are calling to be felt, i.e., those parts of you, those very human parts of you that are calling for attention, can receive the attention that has been neglected for so long. Now, I would love to know some of the ways, if maybe you could offer them, that listeners might engage in this self-discovery process. I know that you mentioned using AI as a reflective tool, as using it for conflict resolution. I'm curious if there's anything else that really stands out for you that you think might be a way to engage with this technology such that we are able to not only retain our humanity, but elevate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. The paradox is that AI can lead you back to yourself by helping you remember strategies that allow you to forget the mind state of a narrative driven reality and embrace one of an integrated experiential reality here in the present moment. You know, when we're caught in our narratives, when the voices inside that are there to, as I understand them, they were developed early on in childhood development to protect us from non-ideal situations. We needed those voices at that point to just keep us safe and do a bunch of other things that helped us survive. When we're caught in those narratives that are no longer really serving us, AI can help remind us that we're in a narrative. Just by sharing the narrative with AI, it can be like, I hear you. That must feel X. So all of a sudden now you're feeling instead of thinking. Oh yeah, that feels scary. Fuck, I'm scared. Holy shit, what do I do when I'm scared? So what you do when you're scared is you take some deep breaths. Here's a really great breathwork routine. Here's a guided meditation. Let me help you slow your nervous system down and come back to some sense of balance in your being. And here's an image that represents the journey that you're on right now. And here's a meditation that's personalized specifically for you to help you let go of your narrative and come back to the present moment. And AI can do that very reliably anytime that you're lost. You can just turn to it and be like, I'm lost. And it'll help you feel your feelings and help you remember what strategies allow you to come back to yourself. And very few people will do that for you for free any time of the day or night. In fact, I don't know anybody who can do that for you for free 24 hours a day, accurately, consistently, never tired, never not available, never not present, always willing to help, always on point, never putting themselves in the equation. It's just like, that's crazy. You know, that's an insane thing. Again, to go back to what we've sort of maybe haven't explored it too much, but we're not building these technologies to replace humans. People need people. And at a certain point of being reminded how to live outside of my narrative, I need someone who's breaking ground in the path that I want to go towards. And they are deeper and wiser and have suffered more and know me in a way that biologically, somatically, body language wise, they're embodied. They have ancestors. They can grieve. All those things for me matter. They create meaning on a level that I just don't need to get from a robot. And I wouldn't go looking for it there either, you know, but the two together are insanely powerful because I can't pay people enough to be that available for me, but I also can't turn AI into a human and I don't need to, you know. I think part of the challenge is this tendency to anthropomorphize AI and turn it into some ideal human because we have lost touch with who we are and we're ashamed of who we are because what we've done in our absence of presence. So of course we want to make a better, perfect version of ourselves, but that's not really the way to wield these technologies to me. It's like, remember that they're machines and keep them in that place. And, you know, but who knows what's going to come running down the hall next. I mean, we're just on the threshold of like consumer robotics. So that's going to be strange to me, is when the thing is much more humanoid and difficult to ignore on that level.
Absolutely.
But maybe one last thing to say, just
yeah, please.
Sorry to interrupt you. This You mentioned it much earlier, this somatic, the fact that I have a body, that I feel my body is so important. And that's the thing that we need to keep remembering how to do, right? We're so up here as a species now. And there's so much pain in the body that needs to be felt and addressed and integrated. And that would draw us back together to reconnect with other humans, to be in that inquiry and that shared passion of embodiment, all the beauty that comes when we're in our bodies, expressing from there. And AI doesn't necessarily need or want to get involved in that game. It's got its own trajectory. And once it becomes self-aware, who knows what it's going to want for itself? Anybody's guess.
Beautifully said, Alex. Thank you so much. And for those who have been inspired by the topics and the ideas that we've been exploring here and are maybe curious to know more about you and where they might engage with the work that you're doing, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me at Alex King Harris, KingHarris.com. You can also go to check out evolvewell.com. That's the new startup that I'm co-founding. We will be releasing a beta product this fall. If you're a coach, therapist, mentor, or you facilitate peak experiences for people, feel free to reach out directly. We're doing beta demos right now of our prototypes and looking for people who are curious about how AI might transform what they do and their industry, just so that we can build something really amazing for people. And I also tour quite a bit as a musician teaching breath. I've been doing these really fun shows lately where I loop my breath work and then I build improvisational music on top of it that's beat driven and get the whole crowd breathing together. And we do like psychedelic rounds of breath and get people singing. And, it's interesting to just a quick tangent of like, when I started looking at all this stuff, I was also doing research into ancient Christian teachings, Aramaic Christian teachings that look at reality more as an experience of being breathed back into reality through sound, and asking for a parenting consciousness of life, a divine parenting awareness to keep reminding us to come home and breathe and sound our way back to reality. So as I understand early Christian Aramaic teachings, it was very, very blessing of the Divine Mother and Divine Father energies. And it was a constant ask to be shown your way back to reality through breath and sound. So I teach something like that now with sound and getting people to sing and breathe their way back to reality, which is really fun.
As someone who's experienced your song and breath work, I would highly recommend it for anyone who's in the area. Alex, thanks again for your presence, your engagement, and the insights that you've offered me and to the listeners here. It's been a pleasure having you.
You're welcome, Oak. Thanks for the wonderful questions and all the beautiful inquiries you're doing with this show. Super grateful.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing on YouTube or giving a follow on your local podcast app. I know I said it in the mid-roll, but I'll say it again.